Which is easier, forgiving sins or telling a paralyzed man to walk? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Mark on walking through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, turn to Mark chapter 2. We're going to be reading from verses 1 to 12. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Mark chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. And again he entered Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in the house. Immediately many gathered together, so that there was no longer room to receive them, not even near the door. And he preached the word to them. Then they came to him, bringing a paralytic, who was carried by 4 men. And when they could not come near him, because of the crowd, they uncovered the roof where he was. So when they had broken through, they let down the bed on which the paralytic was lying. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven you." And some of the scribes were sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak blasphemies like this? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" But immediately when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they reasoned thus within themselves, he said to them, "Why do you reason about these things in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven you,' or to say, 'Arise, take up your bed and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, arise, take up your bed, and go to your house." Immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went out in the presence of them all. So that all were amazed and glorified God, saying, "We have never saw anything like this." At the end of the last chapter, we had Jesus being driven out of the cities and into the deserted places because the multitudes that came to be healed were too great in number. Coming out of chapter 2, the situation had obviously died down a little bit, so he returned to Capernaum. However, once it was known that he was there, the crowds began forming, filling the house that Jesus was in. Mark says that there wasn't even room near the door. Now, the events that Mark records for us here, again, will support Mark's thesis that Jesus is the Son of God, having power from heaven as well as absolute authority. Matthew also contains this event in Matthew chapter 9, verses 2 to 8, and events we studied in our Matthew series. Now, as we said earlier, the crowd at the house where Jesus was very large. That meant that nobody could come in or out if they could walk, nor could anybody carrying someone on a cot walk in or out. However, Mark tells us of a paralytic man who desperately wanted to see Jesus. His friends could have simply told the man to come back when the crowds were smaller, but that's not what they did. Instead, the friends uncovered the roof and lowered the paralytic man down through the roof in order to get closer to Jesus. These actions of faith impressed Jesus to the point where he told the paralytic man that his sins were forgiven. Now, on the surface, this might seem as a bit of a letdown, for this man really wanted to walk. But in the grand scheme of things, this man didn't need to walk in order to be saved. However, he did need his sins forgiven. So while Jesus didn't give this man what he originally wanted, he did give this man what he needed. Now the scribes who witnessed this said to themselves that Jesus was blaspheming, for who could forgive sins but God alone? The question we have to answer thus before we get to Jesus' response is, were the scribes correct in their reasoning about the charge that they were leveling at Jesus? When Jesus told the paralytic man that his sins were forgiven him, was he talking about sins that the man committed against Jesus? No, because for all we know, this man had never met Jesus before. Was he forgiving the sins against some other person? No, for Jesus would have no right to forgive the sins committed against someone else. And so the only conclusion that can be drawn is that Jesus was forgiving the man's sins against God. But if Jesus isn't God, then just like he wouldn't have the right to forgive the sins committed against somebody else, he wouldn't have the right to forgive sins committed against God. Only God had the right to forgive sins committed against himself. So in this, the scribes were right. Jesus, knowing their hearts, whose objections they merely kept to themselves, called them out for the evil in their hearts. He asked them which was easier, to forgive sins or to tell a paralyzed man to stand up and walk. Of course, forgiving sins was easier because forgiving sins cannot be seen or felt. It must be accepted on the basis of faith. Jesus, however, did the easier thing first so that when he healed the man, they would know that he had the power to forgive sins. He then healed the man, and the man immediately walked. The multitude saw this and were amazed and glorified God, saying that they had never seen anything like this. This is truly an amazing story, which helps show us that because Jesus was able to heal this man after claiming to forgive his sins, it proved that Jesus is God, for only God had the power to forgive sins committed against him. With that, our time is up for today. Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Mark chapter 2, verses 13 to 17, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not ashamed.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.